We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Bruce Cunningham, the Dean of the Sanford School for 5 more months. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the Sanford School and to this panel on the impact of big money on democratic politics and the democratic process. I might mention that this idea was the brainchild of Gunter Peck, who will be moderating the panelists, and Nick Carnes, who together worked on putting this together. So thank you. And I'll let Gunter introduce the panelists, but I will say a special shout out to David Price, who was here at the beginning of the Sanford School when we were an institute in a few old rooms in Old Chem, and John Sarbanes, who I understand was a roommate of Gunter Peck's when he was in college. I didn't know if Gunter would want to discuss that. So without further ado, here's Gunter.
Thank you. So let me offer a welcome to all of you and offer a few thanks as well before we begin this conversation. First of all, thanks to Bruce for so generously supporting the opportunity that emerged here to bring 2 of the leaders of campaign finance reform in our country together in one room, and to bring a cohort of activists, stakeholders, and academic experts together to listen and learn and discuss these really important issues about campaign finance reform and also electoral challenges caused by big money. I also want to thank the DeWitt Wallace Center for Journalism that is helping support this event, as well as the Scholars Strategy Network that brought many scholars to us, and also to thank Nick, who's been, because of this, we're better friends and better colleagues. Thank you so much, as well as Melissa, who has been very helpful in introducing me to a larger group of people as well. So let me begin and say this is actually part of a 3-part event. Today, what we're doing here is the public event. We have also a couple of conversations that will focus in on this thorny and challenging problem of how big money in some ways is distorting the very ways in which we imagine democracy working, how people are elected, and how legislation can be enacted. And this is a kind of problem that, and I'll speak briefly as an historian here, that has, of course, long roots. And one of the virtues of studying history is that you might imagine that the contemporary crises of debates really have longer histories, and you can take a certain measure of comfort, perhaps, in realizing that these questions about inequality, democracy, money, are deep and as old as this republic itself. And so we're not the first generation to struggle with ways of imagining a better relationship between money and voice and access. But we do stand at a particularly difficult moment, and the speakers will each be talking about the challenges and some of the solutions. But I do want to bring us back. I'm sorry to do this. I have 1 minute to do this. I want to bring us back to a voice from the past who, to me, feels very present. And this is the voice of a worker in 1877 who watched the federal government come in the wake of the Great Railroad Uprising, systematically dismantle the workers' effort to demand fair wages and, in effect, gave up on the political process. And he writes, "We are sick of this game we call democracy. We are soul weary of looking around for some sympathy or spirit of justice. Finding none, we turn to each other." I love that end. We turn to each other. That's what we're doing here today, is to think critically and compassionately about what we as citizens can do about this fundamental challenge. There is, I would say, in the name of this conference, Big Money versus Grassroots Democracy, Empowering Citizens to Take Back Their Government, there are really 2 narratives that are in some tension and that I think will come out. One is a progressive narrative, citizens taking back their government. This is a kind of, we hear this on both the left and the right. The Tea Party uses this very well. Supporters of President Obama have also used that notion of taking back the government. That is the progressive spirit that animates reactions to big money. The other narrative that is in some ways more powerful and perhaps debilitating is this notion of big money corrupting, defiling our government, ruining the democracy. And that is a story that is not new. It is a kind of, if you focus on big money, you can become soul weary. You can become hopeless. You can become, it becomes almost debilitating to imagine how can we rethink our politics in a way that would be better and more representative when money is so pervasive. I don't want us to end with that. I want the speakers, each of them will be, is to think about defining the problem, but also focus on solutions. How can the law be a solution to the very problem that we are encountering post-Citizens United? So I'm going to turn it over to the speakers. We're going to proceed. I will introduce them each before they will speak. They'll speak for 5 to 10 minutes each. And then I'm going to turn it right over to you. I have questions if you do not rise to the occasion, but we'll ask you to ask questions of the speakers, and we'll have a good discussion, and I'll be the moderator of that. Okay, so our first speaker is State Representative Larry Hall, North Carolina's House Democratic leader. He also represents the 29th House District, which includes downtown Durham, North Carolina Central. Do you have Duke as well? I don't know.
East Campus.
You have East Campus. Okay. It's hard to keep up with the gerrymandering that's been afoot. So you are my. That's great. You are my. I live off East Campus, so you're still my rep. Hall is a member of the North Carolina Legislature's Black Caucus, a decorated member of the United States Marine Corps. He also serves as chair of the executive committee of the Durham branch of the NAACP. Larry Hall.
Well, first I want to say good evening. I'm glad. Thank you. In the legislature and the atmosphere we have now, very seldom do we hear any applause when we speak, so you caught me off guard on that. But first of all, I'm glad to see so many people interested in this dynamic about your participation in government and policy making and what the role is of money now versus what it should be and what you'll make it be. In North Carolina in particular, we've kind of had a clear view of how money corrupts the process and what results from that. And we're going to continue to see that in action, and you'll see it in bills that are filed in this legislative term as well. You'll note who the targets of money are. And many times you'll find yourself being one of those targets, whether you're young folks or senior citizens or people who need job retraining or, as in the case of many of you, folks who are pursuing education that is being devalued and minimized to say that you shouldn't learn to think, you should only learn to do. We don't need a thinking class. We need people who can just turn widgets if that's what needs to be done. And so listen to the broad policy outlines, I would say, of people who have been elected and what they talk about. They mean it. They mean it. And they're filing bills to carry it out. So whether they're taking away the rights of women to choose, to be respected in the workplace, to be paid a fair wage, or taking away the opportunity for people to even get education, they mean it. So please don't think it's just rhetoric on their part. When they have the amount of control they have, there is no fair and balanced debate. There is no consideration of an alternative method of achieving things. I want to talk briefly about our governor and this new era, and the question everyone has about our governor, who obviously is a product of moneyed interests. Many of you have heard of Art Pope or the Civitas Institute and other organizations who certainly have a tremendous amount of money and have built out a tremendous infrastructure that runs on supporting folks who believe in what they say. And some folks said they had the best legislature that money could buy 2 years ago, and that was on the policy side, not on the character side. And now they feel they have the best governor money could buy. And so now the contest begins. Does the legislature have priority over the governor? Does the governor's vision have priority over the legislature? Do they share one vision because they share one benefactor? And that's what you have to examine when you look at the policies. Real quickly, the money that's in politics. And you've heard over and over how much is there, too much. Too much is based upon how much you have. And right now, we have a particular appreciation for that because we're on the opposite end of the money machine. We had in North Carolina, in House races, even in the newly drawn districts, we had 7 districts that we lost by a total of 7,400 votes. Money and votes, money and politics. 7 seats that we lost this cycle that we contend, unfortunately, had we had more money or more votes or a combination thereof, we could have won. In some of those districts, we were outspent by record funds. We had a district in Charlotte that they came in and bought, actually it was in Asheville, but it's in the Charlotte market. They came in and bought advertising in the market that barely touched the area because they had so much money, they didn't need to target it. They could just blanket the whole area and blanket all the airwaves. And we lost, that was one of the ones we lost by less than 1,000. Think about this. When we talk about why is voter ID important, think about the things that go along with it. Voter ID, expensive solution to a problem that doesn't exist. So we're always saying we don't have the money, number one. Number two, same day voter registration, cutting the period of same day early vote. What do you do when you do that? You don't just cut the period, you cut the opportunity to register and to vote. Extremely important when we talk about losing 7 races by 7,400 votes. Well, if we can make it so that many more people can't even physically vote, then whoever is in power to make that decision has a better chance to preserve their power and their position. Finally, publicly funded campaigns. That is the way to go as best we can do it. Many cities have tried it, states have tried it, countries have tried it. We need to go to that. As I said, otherwise we end up with what we have now, the best governorship, the best legislature that money can buy. And we will make it so other people don't have sufficient access to the economic system to participate in that game. And that's not what we want in North Carolina nor in America.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Our next speaker is Anita Earls, who is the founder and executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, a nonprofit advocacy organization founded right here in Durham that litigates cases on behalf of the poor throughout the South. She has been a civil rights attorney for 25 years, working on issues of structural racism, voting rights, and community empowerment. She's a member of North Carolina's Equal Access to Justice Commission and previously served on the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And she also served as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice during the Clinton administration.
Good afternoon. I am really honored to be on such a distinguished panel, and so thank you for the opportunity to address this really important topic. I do come at this from the perspective of someone who actually never has been elected to public office, but someone who's really litigated these issues. So not so much writing the laws, but filing lawsuits to either enforce them or keep them on the books in this arena. And also someone who works with community-based groups that are trying to become more engaged in policy, in government, in the politics of their community. Finally, a perspective that comes from being on the Board of Elections, which has some enforcement responsibilities towards our campaign finance laws. So it's been interesting to see from the enforcement side how some of the campaign finance regulations work. But what I want to do in my short time is I'm actually going to reverse things. I'm going to talk about what some of the legal options are in light of Citizens United, and then give you an example of why it's such a big problem, and why some of which will highlight why some of those options are only partially useful to us. Overall, I want to say that I have long believed that the problem of money in politics, I've been doing voting rights work for 25 years, and that the problem of money in politics is a civil rights issue. And there's been some grassroots recognition of this. There was a group called the Fannie Lou Hamer project that was in North Carolina, was trying to address campaign finance issues. And so from time to time, there's been even broader recognition that if you're talking about the equal right to participate in the political process, you can't ignore the distorting effect that money has on that process. So we are in this Citizens United realm where the Supreme Court has told us that corporations are people and they have the right of free speech and they can spend as much as they want to in the political process. What can we do about it? Certainly disclosure is a realm that the court did not close off. And so by that I mean laws that require the entities that are spending all this money to disclose where they got it from. And that certainly has some utility, and there's some national high-profile examples where I think if the money that had been spent, if you knew who was spending it, it would help you assess the impact of the message that you're getting. So that's one route still open for legislation at various levels. And then, of course, the public financing. And I think in North Carolina, we have a very good example of the value of public financing in our judicial elections, where there are all, for the Court of Appeals and the state Supreme Court, numerous candidates who qualify for the public financing and will tell you that they could not have run and would have not been able to be elected or serve on the bench if they had not had that opportunity to have public financing. So an opening up of the process, public financing really can make a difference. But those are sort of at the edges. I think a third strategy that I hope people in academia who have more time to think about these things are working on are legal strategies to chip away or actually outright overturn Citizens United. And I will, if that seems impossible, I want to remind you of another civil rights area of law, but in 1986, we had the Bowers versus Hardwick decision that said that it was perfectly legal for states to regulate consenting behavior of adults in their own home. So this was it's okay to make consensual homosexual relations illegal, and you can go and arrest people. That was Bowers versus Hardwick. And so crime against nature was a crime, and people got arrested and prosecuted for it. And that seemed like a pretty awful thing. It was sort of like the Plessy versus Ferguson of our era. And it only took until 2003 for Lawrence versus Texas, the court to say, no, that's wrong. It's unconstitutional for states to try to regulate what people do in their homes. So that is, much longer than we'd want to have that kind of rule in the books, but it worked. It happened. And so I put a challenge out there to my colleagues in the legal field working on campaign finance to shorten that time. If we got Bowers versus Hardwick overturned from '86 to 2003, let's get Citizens United overturned in even shorter time. And I think there are ways to begin to put in front of the courts the strong evidence of the corrupting influence of money in our political process that can chip away at Citizens United. But there's a fourth strategy, and that is a constitutional amendment. And because of the fact that there is, in fact, no right to vote enshrined in our Constitution, there has been for some time some legal scholars and others, including national groups like the Advancement Project, that have put forward an agenda that says we need a constitutional amendment that gives us a right to vote. There's some other things we could put in there, like voting rights for residents of D.C., and campaign finance could be another area that you could put into a constitutional amendment. And, I'm not Pollyannish about how difficult it is to amend the United States Constitution, but I do think that including campaign finance issues on that agenda of what a right to vote amendment should look like is another promising way. So those are my quick overview of legal options. I know there are others that I haven't raised, but those are some big ones. So let me give you my example of why this is such a big problem. This is a North Carolina example and one that I've been litigating. And what I want to talk about is the role that money played in our state Supreme Court race between Justice Newby and Sam Ervin. In the early days of that contest, or actually as late as October 1st, public policy polling showed that Irvin was leading Newby by a 31 to 23 margin in the polls. Now, there was a huge part of the electorate that didn't know either two candidates, but for those who had a choice, Irvin was leading. 2 weeks later, the margin was essentially the same, 32% to 24%. And then actually just about a week before the election, Irvin was still leading. The margin was smaller, but he led by 39 to 35%. Why did Paul Newby, or what happened between the week before the election and the election when Justice Newby won re-election? What happened was a huge infusion of nearly $3 million, most of it financed by the Republican State Leadership Committee, and I can run down how much money they spent when, but they spent a whole bunch of it between October 22nd and November 5th of the election, day before the election. And I'm sure you all saw the banjo ads, right? That was this committee. It was not the candidate, right? It clearly impacted the outcome of the election. So why if the Republican State Leadership Committee wants to spend money that way, why shouldn't they be able to? Well, they also spent money to pay for the consultants who advised the General Assembly that drew the redistricting maps, that Justice Newby is sitting on a case in front of the court now, or they ruled last Friday, but there was an issue in front of the court dealing with that redistricting case, and there were plenty of people making the direct link between this money from the Republican State Leadership Committee, who had funded essentially drawing the maps, now funding the re-election of a judge who's going to rule on the legality of those maps. So we did file a motion asking Justice Newby to recuse himself. It's been denied. We don't know why. We have no opinion why, and there are some Supreme Court precedents that ultimately might give us an issue for appeal. But I represent in this redistricting litigation nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations challenging the redistricting maps, and they now know that they have to have the fairness of their claims judged by someone whose re-election happened because of all this money from this group that had a certain view on the plans. And part of the problem with how the independent expenditures work is that Justice Newby can distance himself from that. I mean, people talk about how the problem with independent money is that candidates lose control over their campaigns, but they also lose accountability. He says, I didn't spend that money. That had nothing to do with me. The banjo ads were what they were. I didn't do it, so why should I have to recuse myself? The case I referred to, the Supreme Court case of Caperton versus Massey Coal Company, was similarly a case where there was outside expenditures, and the Supreme Court said where they influenced the election, a judge should recuse himself. But the point is just that when we have money spent this way, there's really a lack of accountability throughout the system in all sorts of ways. And you can have disclosure. We can know that the Republican State Leadership spent it. We can have public financing. Both Newby and Irvin got public financing, and yet still this outside spending, in my view, corrupted the democratic process. So we have to continue highlighting the costs to democracy that big money inflicts.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Congressman David Price, who, as you know, represents North Carolina's 4th District, which has shifted boundaries because of that gerrymandering. And I am sad to say that David is no longer officially my representative, but I still think of you as my representative. And, well, you are, so I'll just put it that way. So I actually first met David, you may not remember this, but when I was registering voters and organizing a canvass of getting people out to vote in 2008. And suddenly I noticed an elderly gentleman next to me helping train volunteers on how to get the vote out. And I turned, and it was David Price, very much part of a grassroots effort. And I deeply appreciated that first encounter. So on with the formal introduction. He represents the current district, parts of Alamance, Orange, Durham, Wake, Harnett, Chatham, and Cumberland counties. He received his undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill and went on to Yale to earn a Bachelor of Divinity degree, as well as a PhD in political science. Before he began serving in Congress, Price was a professor of political science and public policy, as you know, here at Duke University. He's the author of 4 books on Congress and the American political system. Price currently serves on the House Appropriations Committee and serves as the ranking Democrat on the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, which oversees funding for the Department of Homeland Security. He is a member of the Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for housing, transportation, and legislative branch appropriations. As the ranking member also of the House Democracy Partnership and an outspoken advocate for Middle East peace, Price is also recognized as a leader on foreign policy issues. In North Carolina, David's constituents know him as a strong supporter of education, accessible health care, affordable housing, clean air and water, and improved transportation alternatives. He is also the author of the Citizens Empowerment Act, which is one of the major campaign finance reform bills in the current 113th Congress. It is my great pleasure to introduce David Price to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thank you. It's great to be back at Duke here in this familiar space. Lisa, my wife, is with me, and also Laura Thrift, who works on campaign finance issues, other issues in our DC office. Have limited time here. I think probably what I can best do to start us off anyway is to talk about the threats and some of the possible remedies in very broad terms. Try to give a broad overview of the lay of the land, and then in the discussions to follow, we can go wherever you would like. First, the threats. What are these threats to a grassroots democracy? We're concentrating tonight on the money threats, the threats of big money, but I think it's very clear, especially from what Larry said earlier, that there are also threats in terms of policy, election policy, and a systematic effort around the country to suppress the vote. There have been systematic efforts, and they are linked to a political party, to the Republican Party, to restrict early voting, to restrict registration, to require photo IDs, to purge the voting rolls. I mean, you've heard of those efforts. Some of them have been dealt with by the courts. The ID laws in particular have been turned back for now in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Florida. But believe me, there were many, many problems on Election Day. They shortened the early voting down in Florida from 14 days to 8. People waited up to 7 hours in line in the state of Florida to vote. What if this election had been closer than it was? Think about this. As of mid-December, there were 17 states still counting their votes. 17 states in this country were still counting absentee and provisional ballots as of December 15th. Now, we've had some important reforms in North Carolina. We have early voting. People love early voting. We have same-day registration. Our turnout in this state went from 59% in 2000 to 70% in 2008. But as Larry has indicated, every one of those reforms is vulnerable, is due probably for reversal. Big money, the other threat to grassroots democracy. Unaccountable money, interested money. Now, there's been a fair amount of satisfaction taken, including, I suppose, on my part, that Karl Rove seems to have wasted so much of his money. The batting average wasn't very good. He spent $176 million. He batted something like, he had about a 6.5% return. Sheldon Adelson, he coughed up $90 million. That's 0.37% of his net worth. And Adelson came up pretty empty-handed as well. However, Adelson's money likely put a Republican over the top in a Senate race in Nevada. And as far as Rove's Crossroads organization is concerned, they were back on the air almost immediately after the election. $500,000 worth of attack ads urging Republicans to hold the line on taxes. The greatest impact of this money is down the ballot. And 2010, lest we forget, 2010 was the big year in terms of a lasting impact. We know how much that money accomplished in this state, both in the congressional and the General Assembly realms, and we also know that it was a bad year to have a bad year because those Republican gains got locked in. North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan got locked in by redistricting. In both North Carolina and the nation, Democrats this past November won a majority of the vote for the U.S. House. In North Carolina, we have 4 seats out of 13 to show for it, almost 3 it was. In the country as a whole, we're just barely over 200 votes, although we won over 50%. That is redistricting, and that is big money and the effect on the 2010 election as much as any other factor we could imagine. Bob Moser has written, this is a great issue of the American Prospect, just out. Bob Moser calls this unaccountable money dark money, super PACs, so-called social welfare groups. It overwhelmingly supports Republicans and conservatives. 80% of the dark money went for Republican candidates. And the total, by the way, was $6 billion. What do the solutions look like? Again, let me just paint the broad picture. On the voter suppression front, of course, you have a kind of threshold question of to what extent these are federal issues. I think the case is becoming stronger and stronger that they need to be federal issues. Not that the federal government needs to dictate the details of voting law in each and every state, but there should be a floor. There should be a floor of standards, minimum standards that the states need to meet. And some of our colleagues have put forward legislation that is aimed at doing that. John Lewis, Jim Clyburn, Steny Hoyer, others have put forward what they call the Voter Empowerment Act. It would institute same-day registration as a national practice. Online registration would protect the right to vote of those who have finished their prison time, who have paid their debt to society. It would strengthen provisional ballot provisions. Nothing on voter ID, surprisingly, but really we have to ask ourselves, are the court protections sufficient to hold off what the states, including this state, might do on requiring voter ID? George Miller has a bill aimed at the long lines requiring states to meet standards in terms of waiting times. Presumably that would, one of the best way to meet that would be to institute early voting. On the big money front, there also are legislative solutions. I hope Anita's right that one of these days a constitutional amendment, or certainly, or at least a reconstituted Supreme Court, maybe that's the more realistic goal here, a reconstituted Supreme Court could reverse some of this, because it is really tough to deal in this area as long as that constitutional decision, the Citizens United decision, and really other decisions. Supreme Court decisions in this area have been problematic all the way to Buckley v. Vallejo, all the way back. And there have been amendments proposed. In some ways, I think the very simplest amendments, the ones that were proposed way back when this first became a problem, are still the most promising. But we do need a constitutional amendment or a reconstituted court. Short of that, what can we do? Most of the discussion has focused on disclosure. I have worked for years in the area of disclosure. Where is Mac McCorkle? Everybody knows. All right, up there. Mac McCorkle is a disclosure expert. In fact, it may not be well known, but he is the guy who thought up Stand By Your Ad. With apologies to Tammy Wynette, he also thought up the name of the bill. Stand By Your Ad was adopted in North Carolina and Virginia, and then we took it to the federal level and got it added to the McCain-Feingold legislation years ago. Simply says the candidate has to appear in his or her ad, has to take responsibility for what you have just seen. Now, you may get tired of hearing that. I'm so-and-so. There was a funny story about President Obama. During the campaign, apparently, a mother and her daughter approached the president, and the mother said to her daughter, say, do you know what he does? And he says, yeah, he approved this message. Anyway, he approved this message, and we have to all say that, and that's a good thing. It is a matter of taking responsibility for what's in the ad. I'd like to expand that. I have a bill now called Stand By Every Ad, which would expand this to cover the paid internet ads, to cover robocalls, If you despise the robocalls, at least you ought to know who's doing it. And it would apply to all organizations. Why shouldn't, on a super PAC ad, why you have some nondescript person appearing with a nondescript name? You don't even have that, really. Why not have flashed on the screen the top 5 donors to this group, just so you know who paid for this message? This has been incorporated in what we call the Disclose Act. Chris Van Hollen is sponsoring that bill in the House. It's a lead item, the lead item for the Democratic caucus, and it's the one thing I'm going to talk about this afternoon that might have a fighting chance for approval in the current congressional environment, the Disclose Act. Not much Republican support, in fact, none. Mitch McConnell used to say that the one aspect of this that he approved was disclosure. Now he has said that no, that would violate the privacy of donors, and he does not favor any sort of disclosure of who paid for ads. So that's what we're dealing with. There's another aspect of the Citizens United decision, which I've included in the Empowering Citizens Act. It would be tightened rules of affiliation and coordination for the super PACs. For example, they can't be run by former aides or consultants to the candidates. For example, the candidate can't solicit funds for the super PACs. You might have thought that was already the law, but guess again. So those rules could be tightened, perfectly constitutional to say, here are the rules of affiliation and coordination which you have to abide by to even have a halfway plausible claim that this is an independent group. So those two aspects, I think, disclosure and the rules of coordination, are aspects of the Citizens United dilemma, which also applies to the social welfare groups, which we could work on and be totally within constitutional bounds. Very, very hard, though, to get Republican support for any of these days. An area that used to be, witness McCain-Feingold, used to be a bipartisan area. It isn't anymore. And then finally, public financing. Larry, maybe I'll leave to you a little more elaboration maybe on our North Carolina public financing. We've been a pioneer in this area. We've had a checkoff fund for our state political parties. We have partial public financing for some council of state candidates, for some judges. I assume all that is in jeopardy with the new General Assembly leadership, but tell me otherwise. I would love to hear it. I think in the public financing front federally, probably the most important thing would be to salvage what we already have. The main reform coming out of Watergate, namely presidential public financing. We need to modernize it in terms of the time frame over which it applies, the dollar amounts and so forth, but it's a great case for mending it, not ending it. And the Empowering Citizens Act does include a revised presidential public financing plan, but bipartisan support for that's virtually disappeared. In fact, Republicans twice, I think, was it? Maybe 3 times in the past Congress voted to repeal public financing for presidential races once and for all. And then finally, congressional public financing. That's a very heavy lift, but there are some precedents. New York City, Los Angeles, the provisions for congressional public financing that I put in the Empowering Citizens Act are very, very close to those city models. The Los Angeles plan, for example, provides 4-to-1 public match for up to $250 of a contribution. That's very similar to what we've put in here. So there's some precedents. There are areas where it's working well, but the idea of public financing is clearly, I think, a long-term goal that we should be doing our best to develop good proposals, credible proposals, and then steadily work on them. So I think the material is there for comprehensive reform. There's plenty of good work that's gone on. There are plenty of promising ideas. The question is, do we have the public sentiment, the public support for anything approaching comprehensive reform. I think there's been a groundswell. I don't know, it doesn't match the post-Watergate sentiment, no doubt, but a lot of people, increasing numbers of people, are appalled by what they see in terms of vote suppression efforts, in terms of the role of big money. So what's it going to take? What's it going to take to get some of this moving and to wash over these high barricades of partisan opposition? That's the question we face.
Our next speaker is indeed my former roommate, but that's not why he is here today. Congressman John Sarbanes, gives me great pleasure to introduce you to, is from Maryland's 3rd Congressional District, which spans portions of Anne Arundel, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Howard County, and Montgomery County in Maryland. In the House of Representatives, he has been appointed to the Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he serves on the Subcommittee on Health and the Subcommittee on Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade. Congressman Sarbanes and his family live in Baltimore, giving him the opportunity to drive home every night and to hear from the people he serves in Congress, which is unusual for most Congress people. Listening to their concerns allows him to better represent Maryland and has shaped the way he does his job in the House of Representatives. In John Sarbanes' short time as a U.S. Congressman, he has established a reputation for honesty, integrity, and mastery of the details of policy. The son of Senator Paul Sarbanes of Sarbanes-Oxley, I know many of you have studied and read that in my 116 classes and debated it, so, and I know what a good law it is. John, like his father, has established a reputation for integrity, principle, and has worked very hard on campaign finance reform as one of his own signature issues, introducing the Grassroots Democracy Act in the current Congress. He has also walked the walk by trying to model grassroots fundraising in his own campaigns, and this raises a fundamental challenge when you're fighting a difficult fight in re-election, and how do you put noble principles into practice? You don't want to unilaterally disarm. One thing I'll just say as well about John Sarbanes, I have known for a very long time, and to my Duke students, to encourage you to debate each other and to have the idealism that John very much possesses in spades and has never given up. He is a dear friend, but also someone I admire who has not lost that spark. The reason for what he's doing is really at the core of who he is. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce John Sarbanes.
Thank you all. I threatened Gunther that if he didn't say nice things about me, I would start telling stories from when we were roommates. So that worked out pretty well for me. It's great to be here at Duke. Dean, thank you for welcoming us here to the Sanford School of Public Policy. I want to say to Larry Hall that I hope that God is on your side, because it's going to be a tough fight. There's no question that North Carolina is going to be a battleground state in this fight against big money that we need to undertake across the country. But what you're facing here and the examples that you have at your fingertips of how it's distorting government and public policy, I think can be very powerful to the rest of the country. And Anita Earls, I'm going to come back to your comment about the right to vote amendment, because I think actually your proposal of consolidating that with a constitutional amendment about campaign finance is intriguing, because it really gets to the same issue. Our right to vote, the meaning of our vote, is being undermined by the influence of big money. So we need to really address those things simultaneously. As for David Price, I feel very privileged to be here in his stomping grounds. He is a terrific leader in Congress. He's known there, as I imagine he's known here, as a very thoughtful person who pays attention to detail, who understands policy. He's obviously a deep thinker given his background, and you spotted that by having him associate with this institution a long time ago. But I've enjoyed working with David and others in Washington as we're trying to grapple with this issue of how do we push back on big money in politics. So what I'm going to try and do is do this in 5 minutes so we can turn the rest of the program over to you for questions and we can have an interactive discussion here. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what the money is doing to us, and I'm going to do it wearing two different hats. One is as a member of Congress. The other is as a citizen, like everybody else, somebody who drives home every night to Baltimore and then looks back on Washington and wonders what can we do to fix this broken system. So as a member of Congress, probably the most obvious thing that it's doing to the institution is it's making it necessary for members to spend an inordinate amount of time raising money. There's a guy named Rick Nolan who served from 1976 to 1981. Then he, as he puts it, he took a nap for 30 years and he just came back to Congress after 32 years. And the first impression he had was the amount of time that members of Congress are spending on fundraising. Larry Lessig, who's written the book Republic Lost, estimates based on interviews that he did with members of Congress that the average member now spends 30 to 70% of their time raising money, which means that in some ways we're professional fundraisers first and professional legislators second. Now, the impact of this is felt a number of different ways, but I'll mention a couple. Because you don't have time to do other things, the casualties are, first, that you don't have enough time to look at the material, to really study from a public policy standpoint what you should be doing and how you can best represent the interests of your constituents, and that's incredibly frustrating to people who are there and there for the right reasons. The second thing is you don't have the time, and David could probably speak to this, the time to spend getting to know your colleagues, building those relationships, which really in a legislative arena is the thing that helps you to broker good, sound public policy. You know, Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they authored together some of the most important public policy that we've seen in the history of our country because they had a personal relationship, a friendship that they developed over time. You don't have the time to do that when you're spending 30 to 70% of your time fundraising. So this is incredibly frustrating for the average member of Congress. Then you add to the mix the advent of the super PACs. And this means that many of our colleagues are walking around a lot of the time with their hands sort of shaking, wondering when is a super PAC going to come in and take them out. It creates this atmosphere of fear, which is also debilitating to the process of making good public policy. I've started to refer to super PACs as money drones because you're a candidate, you're walking down the sidewalk, and you hear a humming noise behind you. And next thing you know, some super PAC has dropped a $500,000 payload on you of negative advertising, and you're gone, you're obliterated from the political map. And the thing is, because we don't have good disclosure, as David was saying, you don't even know who's operating that drone. They're completely hidden a lot of the time. But they're having a negatively terrific impact on our process of politics and government. So that's the perspective of a member of Congress now that is inside this money-drenched culture in Washington, who, again, wants to do the right thing, wants to represent the interests of people that have sent them there, but is increasingly constrained in their efforts to do that by the influence of big money. Now let me take that hat off and put on the hat of a citizen. And as I go around my district and talk to people, and I know David has the same experience and most of my colleagues, you're encountering a deep, deep cynicism among people out there when it comes to whether their voice can be heard anymore. They say to themselves, how can my voice be heard? If I make a $10 contribution or a $25 contribution, how can my voice be heard when Sheldon Adelson can put $31 million into campaigns. And as a result of that, people are feeling defeated, they're feeling frustrated, and a lot of them are sort of giving up on whether Washington and the political process can solve their problems. So we have to find a way to address this deep, deep cynicism. The other thing that they feel, and they feel it in their gut, they don't necessarily understand how all the dots connect to make this a reality, but they feel somehow that the government is bought and sold by big interests, moneyed interests, special interests. Now, I don't think it's bought and sold. I don't think members of Congress are bought and sold in any kind of classic sense. I don't think members sell their votes. I don't think big money buys their votes. But I do think that there's an increasing dependency that's developing within the institution of Congress on these sources of big money. Because if you've got to raise on average $1.5 million every 2 years to run a congressional campaign, and that's the figure, you have to go to where the money can be dispensed quickly and in large amounts, and that tends to be people who've got deep pockets. So it's no surprise that when it comes time to make public policy, the institution of Congress ends up leaning in the direction of special moneyed interests and away from the public interests more often than it should. And I think that the public consensus, and they're frustrated and they're outraged by it, and they're looking for some way to respond. So what are some of the things that we can do? David's touched on a lot of them. I think disclosure is absolutely critical, making sure there's transparency and accountability in terms of these moneyed sources, so you've got to push back in that way. Trying to remedy the effects of the Citizens United case with various efforts, whether that's sort of building the jurisprudence that will finally allow a right-thinking, and I mean correct-thinking, Supreme Court to make a different kind of decision about how we constrain money in politics, but also taking advantage of this groundswell out in the country to try to repeal the Citizens United case through a constitutional amendment. Now, that's very, very difficult to do. You need 2/3 vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate, and then you got to go out and get 3/4 of state legislatures to pass it. But as a movement organizing vehicle, I think this push for a constitutional amendment has tremendous value, and you don't know where it'll end up. I mean, when you do surveys of the public on Citizens United, the number of people, the percentages that say they'd like to overturn it exceed 2/3 and exceed 3/4 in many instances. So if we could match our representatives' execution of their job to the way the public feels, we might actually get that kind of thing. So that's another outlet through which we can sort of channel this anger that people are feeling. Both of those are about kind of restraining bad actors in the system. Public funding and building alternative systems of funding campaigns is about empowering good actors, empowering ordinary people to take back their government. And that's why I've become so interested in this topic, because I think it responds most directly to the sense of powerlessness that so many people feel. And the basic components of how you do this are pretty well agreed upon. You need to find a way to activate the grassroots, get grassroots donors involved in the process. In the bill that I've introduced, which is the Grassroots Democracy Act, we try to accomplish that by offering a refundable tax credit of up to $50 over a 2-year period for congressional campaign contributions. So now it becomes much easier, if you get something like that in place, for grassroots participation, because in a sense you're going to get your tax money back for that investment that you make in the political process. But then, as David said, you also have to have a kind of multiple match component, so that you take the voice of the $25 donor and you amplify it by 5 times or 10 times, whatever the multiple will be, and in that way you begin to combat the voice that the big money is able to purchase. So those are 2 critical components. And then I think a third piece is, how do you deal with the presence of these super PACs and outside money that's flowing into the system? And can we create mechanisms that would give grassroots candidates some additional support in situations where that kind of money is coming at them? That's tricky. There are constitutional implications of that, and this court tends to frown upon solutions that are seeking that. But there are things that we can do, and we need to keep it in the discussion. So these are some of the remedies that we can put forward: disclosure, transparency, pushing back on Citizens United, but fundamentally also empowering the grassroots to take back their government by becoming part of the funding side of the equation. I'll give you one more analogy or metaphor for how these super PACs are operating, and then I'll bring it to a close. I mentioned that I think of them as money drones, but another way of looking at what super PACs accomplished in this last election cycle is they kind of set up an old-fashioned protection racket. So here's how it works. An industry funds super PACs to go out and be the muscle guys on the street, and they intimidate the candidates. Then the candidates, who have to raise more money as a result of that, they turn to the traditional PAC community and other big funders who are getting money or funneling money from the same industry to be protected from that. But it's all being orchestrated by the same industry or industries. The protection shouldn't be coming from one arm of the industry that's creating the problem. The protection ought to be coming from the public. The protection ought to be coming from the grassroots. And that's what you enable when you build a hybrid grassroots public funding system to help lift up grassroots candidates and help them fight back against this incredible influence of money. Fundamentally, this issue is about protecting your franchise. When you elect David Price or you elected John Sarbanes and you send them to Washington, you have the expectation that when they get there, they will represent your interests. But more often than not, when members get to Washington, they are forced by this money system to start representing the interests of big industry and money. And so you've lost your franchise. So a grassroots contribution multiplied by 5 or 10 times, in effect, is a way to protect your franchise, to let the candidate that you elect continue to represent you when they get to Washington. Thank you all very much.
Thank you each for those thoughtful, provocative comments. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to the audience for questions and conversation. I have just one request, that people ask a question, and that the topic of big money, of course, could elicit, each one of us could create a soapbox and talk on it. There's nothing wrong with a comment, but I do want you to think of a question that will open up a conversation. So the floor is open. I have several questions I'd like to ask, but I'd like to hear from students and experts and people here attending. If you could also just say your name so we know who you are when you come to the mic. There's a mic in the back, there's a mic up here, and now we'll ready to take questions and acknowledge them. Yeah.
Sure. My name is Emily Carwell, and I have a question for the members that are in office right now. If this is a civil rights issue, I'm wondering what things are you doing without legislation to say that I'm not being controlled by big money? Obviously, you are receiving campaign contributions. You know, are you putting on your television ads your top contributors? What are you doing yourselves to say that you don't want to have money as much of a play in your politics?
Well, that's a great question. It's a question we ought to ask every member of Congress, anyone who's running for office. What are they doing to advance this narrative of pushing back on big money in politics? I decided in my last campaign to do something a little bit risky. I wanted to try to model the way a public campaign, a public funding system would work. So we went to some traditional higher donors, individuals. And by the way, I won't pretend that the influence that individual donors exert on the system is any less than the influence that PACs, for example, exert on the system. And a public funding system that's really robust could help free you from the influence of both. But having said that, I went to a group of higher donors and I said, if you will help me create a challenge fund of a certain amount, then I'll pledge not to touch that money, basically put it in a separate account in my campaign and not touch it until I can go recruit 1,000 grassroots donors. These are people who give $100 or less. So we raised that money very quickly because, frankly, the high donors are fatigued by the current system as well, and they like the idea of experimenting. And then from the point we raised the money and we put it off limits in our campaign, everything about my campaign became focused on the grassroots, because if I didn't build that grassroots network, I couldn't unlock this fund. In a sense, what I did was I raised privately what would be the equivalent of the public fund that you might have if you had a public funding system in place. And what I found was, I mean, the behavior modification was unbelievable. I started spending all my time thinking about how do you reach the grassroots. So every house party turns into a grassroots donor party. You start learning how to use the online tools in order to reach out and build that kind of support. And it got to the end when, I was trying to unlock this fund, it got to where if a $1,000 donor was standing in front of me and a $10 donor was standing in front of me, the person I was paying all the attention to was the $10 donor, because they were the key to making this work. Now, that was just an experiment in my own campaign. We're going to try another version of that that's more precinct-based in this next campaign. But I'd love to get to where that money did come, that sort of matching money and incentive money did come from a public fund rather than from private donors, because I think that would then totally liberate me from the current system that we have. So it's a great question.
I do think that's an interesting experiment, and one that suggests what the result would be of prioritizing small contributions, incentivizing them, and then, of course, making that multiplier effect that would come with the match that would come from the public fund. Ideally, you could fund your campaign. There would be enough money in the system to run a full campaign, and in the TV era, and there have to be full, effective campaigns. But at the same time, have this premium on the number of participants, the small participants whose contributions is what leverages the rest. I think the move that you've seen in these public financing proposals toward concentrating on grassroots empowerment, it's the kind of matching system that has been characteristic of the presidential system at the nomination stage. I mean, that's where a lot of this has been tested. It's not a grant system. It's a matching system that doesn't stigmatize financial participation. We need to underscore that, I suppose. Right? Financial participation is and can be honorable in proportion when it is a true grassroots phenomenon. So you're not stigmatizing it, you're rewarding it. But you're saying to the candidates, you have to really make that kind of broad appeal, and that's how your campaign will be funded. I have always prided myself, I suppose, on the kind of grassroots campaigns we've run, the kind of small house party trademark fundraisers that are also outreach events. I wasn't particularly inclined to claim that as a virtue until I began to see what the alternative looks like these days. I mean, there are incredible numbers of our colleagues now who don't seem to feel that they have any obligation to the whole of their constituency, to ordinary folks. I mean, this business of just cultivating the base, the kind of Karl Rove theory of going after the base, going after whatever it takes to fund your campaign, and just giving the stiff arm to everybody else is an incredible phenomenon. I can't believe, in the end, it's going to be smart politically. But I have to say that some of these folks are testing the limits of that theory, that you just cultivate your group, your intense group. You give everybody else the back of your hand. And of course, the fundraising strategy that goes along with that, you know what that is. It's certainly the opposite of what we're talking about.
Well, and I'll make this pretty quick because your view of fundraising is one of desperation or liberation. And when you're in a 34 vote deficit in a House of Representatives of 120 members, you start to grasp at that straw that's called the big donor. Now, it's important for us to understand that it's not possible when the numbers are that far out of line. You can't grasp for them. They're not there because you're so far out the back door, they don't need you, they won't talk to you, and issues evaporate. And when I say issues evaporate, someone who would have been your ally no longer wants to be seen even talking to you because of the punitive nature of the one-sided leadership and the great vote margin. So what do? For us, what has been important and what we've decided to do is, yes, use media, but how? And we've tried to develop and are continuing to develop coalitions and partners on issues, and that's what we have to do. We can't beat them on money because they're, you know, it used to be computer engineers develop computers. Now computers develop computers. Well, they used to raise money, now their money raises money. So we won't win that race, and we can't. So what we have to do and what we've been forced to do, because we're on the micro donor level down here on the state level. Some states allow corporations to make donations. In North Carolina, it's a $4,000 maximum per election cycle for individuals. So the corporate money is not there except for through C3s and C4s and other methods like that. So we have to build the relationships with the organizations to exponentially put our word out and connect. And that's one thing that we've been able to do that's helped us because of obviously technology and the internet and other things. So that is the key thing for us. When you're in a financial deficit, you have to raise enough to maintain, but what we've done is said we have to be a whole lot smarter and be more collaborative and make sure we work with organizations. And that's what we've done to try to short circuit or get around that issue.
Thank you. Question? Yeah.
Yes, my name is Ben Shantz. I wondered if I may change the topic a little bit towards the actual legislative side of things and how pervasive groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, are in terms of in state houses actually influencing votes or members of the General Assemblies to actually sponsor these voter suppression laws and some of the things we were talking about earlier.
Well, I guess I'll start off on that because they're pervasive at the federal level as well. But certainly to know that they have a game plan that crosses all public policy areas and is connected. And so if you try to think about what they're doing without understanding they're on all fronts and they have unlimited resources and research to support what they're doing, it's a cookie cutter, and you have to understand that when you approach them. In our state house, they have several members, only one Democrat, two Democrats, one who's no longer, one in the House and one in the Senate. The one in the Senate is no longer there. Interestingly enough, that Democrat was drawn out of his district. But I think it's important to understand who is supporting them and see what other states those same tactics were attempted in and use that as a learning curve to try to combat that. But again, you do know what they're about, and you do have to understand how pervasive and how widespread their efforts going to be.
Can I just intervene? Can you clarify what ALEC is for those who don't know?
American Legislative Exchange Council, it's an organization with conservative backers who basically create annual conventions or quarterly conventions to solicit legislators and make sure they comply with the campaign laws, to bring you in and lobby you while they're feeding you and massaging you and educating you on why their principles are the best ones to support in legislation. Then they write the legislation for you, give it to you, and tell you to go back and do it. And the people who sponsored them will now be your campaign donors.
Thank you. Yeah. You want to come up to the mic? Yeah.
I'm Frank Baumgartner, and political science professor at the University in Orange County. My question is really to Congressman Sarbanes about your vision of the drone strike. And if the drone strike only applies to Democrats, I find it difficult to conceive of a system where the Republicans would vote for it. And I wonder if it's possible that one strategy for this is that there be a couple Republican drone strikes to change the distribution of fear. And is there a possible shift in the distribution of fear, of the possible impact, the partisan distribution of fear of big money?
Well, of course, there are some who feel that the way the Democrats should respond to what's happened with the super PACs is to build our own stable of super PACs. And there was a debate that happened at the presidential level in this last cycle about that, because there were natural candidates to be big super PAC donors and supporters for purposes of a super PAC that might support the president, who were uneasy about doing it. Now, as they saw the potential for this to influence the outcome of the election, a number of them did then get into the business of being super PAC supporters. Yeah, I understand that, and I heard an interview, Andy Kroll of Mother Jones the other day interviewed one of the founders of one of the largest super PACs in the country, who is predicting that soon, maybe not by next election cycle, but maybe the one after that, every single member of Congress will have their own super PAC, right? Everyone will have their own sort of muscle person in a super PAC to kind of walk around next to them and protect them. Well, I mean, that vision of where the democracy is just appalling to me. And I guess what I'd like to do is advance this idea of America's super PAC, right? Ordinary people standing up through the combination of making grassroots donations and also endorsing a system of public funding that can then come in and match those donations to, in a sense, say, we'll be the super PAC for the grassroots candidates out there. We're not going to surrender to sort of this private super PAC culture. But if we don't build that America's super PAC alternative, then we very well may end up where everyone's needing their own super PAC, and that's not a political environment in which I really want to live, to tell you the truth. And on that point, let me say, there are members of Congress who are asking themselves every day, is it worth it anymore to do this? Is this what I signed up for? I really believed I was coming to Washington to do the work of the people, and I'm spending 70% of my time stuck in an airless cubicle calling people in Montana who I'll never meet and asking them for $2,000 donations. I mean, talk about demeaning. And they're saying, I could do other things. So good people who want to make a difference for the country are being prevented from doing so by a system that's basically consuming them right now. And the way to push back on that is and look, somebody's going to own the government. This is what I always say to people. And they say, well, it'll cost money to have a public funding system. Of course it'll cost some money. But somebody's going to own your government. Either it's going to be special interests and big money who underwrite the campaigns and in return will lean in their direction and away from the public interest, or members of the public are going to, ordinary citizens are going to say, we will lift the funding of campaigns up on our shoulders, and in return, we'll demand that you go back to making public policy that's in our interest, not the special interest. So I don't want to surrender. I take your point, but let's see if we can build America's super PAC, which is based on the people.
I think that the I think that the attitudes John is describing on the part of members are not totally absent on the Republican side. At least that's my perception.
I agree.
And that's, of course, what you're asking. We have just been through the season when people get appointed to committees, and there's a lot of grousing on both sides, actually, about the kind of fundraising threshold it takes these days to get onto one of the key committees. And there's plenty of grousing among Republicans that not too hard to pick up on. And it is true. I mean, I was just thinking, as John was describing, the kind of drone or carpet bombing or whatever analogy you want to use that takes place the last few weeks of a campaign. And, you know, we saw that right next door. A very fine congressman, Bob Etheridge, subjected to that, and that's why he's not there. You know, we know what that's all about. I think candidates even the candidates who benefit from that have some misgivings about it. I mean, after all, you lose control of your campaign. These groups do extraordinary things. Though I don't know what, I think people have studied this. The percentage of those super PAC ads and those social welfare ads, the percentage of those that are negative is about 90%. It's very, very high. And of course, in some ways, they're doing the dirty work that the candidates and the parties don't want to do, but not every candidate welcomes that necessarily. They're certainly uneasy about it, aware that it could get out of hand. We have in this state, one of our Republican members is signed on to this reform legislation, Walter Jones. There aren't too many who are doing that, but I think it's an important question, you know, and that's what I was really getting at when I said, what is the potential here for, once again, some kind of bipartisan buy-in on this? Are there certain aspects of this that might at least lead to renewed Republican support for disclosure? I think we ought to keep working on it. I think we should keep pushing, and I plan to push, particularly on this proposal to tighten the rules of coordination. I'm not ready to say, well, there's just not going to be any bipartisan potential there. I think there might be.
And I want to pick up on something David said, because I agree that a lot of members who may benefit from this don't feel great about it. Now, they may not feel great about it just because they think it's unseemly, and that's a start. But a lot of them are giving up their independence, because the super PACs that are taking out their opponents are expecting something in return. There's an agenda that they're trying to advance. So do you want to be bought and sold by, I mean, you know, we got to remember this, the influence of big money has to be looked at through two lenses. One is who wins and loses elections, but then the next step is what happens when you get to the governing stage. So you've won the election, terrific. But when you get there, you're handcuffed by the super PAC or the industry or the interest group that got you there. I mean, I can envision someday when, you know, members of Congress will walk around on the floor of the House and they'll have like corporate logos on their suits, like NASCAR drivers or something. Or their patrons will sit up in the, like at the Coliseum, they'll sit up in the gallery and they'll say, well, that's my guy down there fighting. Listen to him, isn't he terrific? Well, you know, what kind of contribution does that represent as an elected representative? So I think that's another reason why both Republicans and Democrats would like to see a different system if they could get there. And many will say if we could get there by snapping our fingers, we'd go. But it's how do you do it? And the grassroots participation of ordinary citizens, I think, can help show the way for many of these members.
I'm sorry, actually, I had two people. So Diane, do you want to? and then you, Sarah.
Thank you all. I'm Diane Roberts, and I live in Orange County where that other school is. So it seems to me that the only ammunition we have is one vote, one person. And that's what's at risk now with many of these voter suppression laws. So I'm hoping that there will be some traction at the federal level for this floor. I've heard about some of these laws that Representative Lewis and Kristen Hildebrand have been put forward. And I hope there's hope for that, because I think there's so much public awareness now after this last election that it's an opportunity to build on that. So my question is, for the state people, one of the things that's not being addressed by these, quote, voter fraud ID laws is absentee voting. That it's not being addressed by that, and if that's the issue that we're trying to address, which is voter fraud, is there a way that progressive groups can use that as a vehicle to draw attention to the real intent of the law, so that at least we're using the public's ire against the implications of this? Since we don't have the money and we don't have the legislators, all we can hope for is public awareness and education.
Well, just speaking for the advocacy groups that have been working on the voter ID issue, and we've certainly tried to point out the cost to the voter of this voter ID proposal, because even if the state has to pay for the ID, a lot of the supporting documents that you need in order to get an ID, you have to pay for. So there's a cost implication in voter ID. But I will honestly say there hasn't been a lot of talk about using the fact that the current proposals don't include absentee ballot, I think for fear that we don't want them to add that, right? So we haven't really been, if we say, well, we're criticizing your proposal because you don't also require IDs for absentee voters, then the easy thing is for them to say, okay, we will. So, yeah.
I also want to just indicate how important it is to fight the battle kind of on the ground that's there now, because the absentee ballot question is a big question, but what happens is when you're in a deficit regarding getting your message out, they're able to go to and create these polls that become self-fulfilling, saying 70% or 60% of North Carolinians want some type of voter ID, and absentee ballots are not something that they'll put in that discussion. It's hard to get that secondary issue out front, and we're kind of having to make the business argument or the financial argument to them that this is a cost, and it's an extremely high cost that gains us nothing, that it's a solution without a problem. And so we've kind of hung our hat on that as well. And again, they could say, well, we'll take some action on absentee ballots. They certainly think that they benefit from absentee ballots. Those of you who get NRA magazines or have seen them, you get an absentee ballot in the NRA magazine targeted for whatever state or jurisdiction or district that you're in. So their absentee ballot program is a great program, and certainly we could emulate that. That's one thing we could emulate and do better. And we have some efforts to legally to use absentee ballots more.
Well, let's see. Did you ask your question still, and then two more? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I do think that, so the first question, what can you do? There was a PAC on the other side supporting Judge Irvin's candidacy, but they didn't raise the same amount of money, and so they couldn't have the same impact. I think fundamentally, it's sort of at a philosophical level, the notion that because the money is distorting our democracy, we're going to take judicial races out of our democratic process, that sort of doesn't jive well with me. But sure, you just throw up your hands and you say, if money see, this is a down ballot race, so many voters don't pay attention, so many lawyers don't even know, a lot of people don't pay attention to these races. If money can have that big of an impact, then maybe we should just have an appointed system. I mean, I think a lot of people go there, but to me, it's a disturbing place to go, because what I want to support is fixing our democracy so the democratic process works. I think on the question of and the second part of your question was about campaign, right. I think that has actually been really effective, and that there are, maybe if we'd had just a little bit more time in the newbie urban race, maybe if the people supporting urban had a little bit more time, they could have done more of that. And there is media that is accessible to a lot of people that isn't high dollar TV advertising. I think, the social media, social networks, internet, there's a lot of ways to reach a lot of voters, especially all of you wonderful young voters. And so I really would encourage naming, shaming, putting the information out there. The whole banjo ad had nothing to do with what a Court of Appeals judge does. The ad implied that Justice Newby could put people in jail, and I promise you, as a Supreme Court justice, he can't do that. So there was a lot to work with there, and I think you got an excellent point.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, Ben.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. It's been very educating listening to you talk on your experiences. I'm Ben Wise, I'm a public policy senior from Marion, South Carolina, Jim Clyburn's district. And I just want to ask you something that's very interesting to me, and something that you mentioned, Representative John Sarbanes, was basically that element of fear from these drone super PACs that can come and kind of shame you or whatever. How does that, and kind of give an insight into everyone else on the panel, how does that influence your emotional and mental states and your attitudes when you're making legislation, which you're only doing 30% or 70% of the time, depending on how successful you are at money raising, which in case if you're trying to do grassroots raising, it's even less most of the time. So just could you speak more to like the emotional, mental states and kind of maybe that environment, that working environment and culture that it has to you? You spoke a little bit on it, but I think that it'd be really illuminating for us to really get into the minds of the very few percent that are able to.
Well, there's certainly an increased state of agitation among our colleagues. Now, I'm gonna confess in a sense, it's not a confession really, but I'm in a relatively safe seat, which is part of the reason I thought I ought to do some experimenting on how you raise money from the grassroots, because in a sense I have the opportunity to do it. I don't judge any of my colleagues who are forced to go wherever they can to find the money, because they're some of them in very, very difficult races. But when I talk to them, when I see, so a lot of them came in when the challenge was, you were told, well, you've got to raise enough money to best an opponent who knows how to go raise money. So they said, well, I can do that. Then the next time out, things shifted a little, and all these self-funders started coming in. So then they said, well, you got to raise enough money so that you can either deter a self-funder or at least be equipped to handle a self-funder. Well, that was a higher bar to clear and caused more agitation and anxiety, but a lot of people were able to do that too. But now they're coming and they're saying, okay, you got to go raise enough money to combat a super PAC that's going to come out. Well, what is that number, right? I mean, and you don't know when it's going to come. It can come suddenly and out of nowhere. The traditional ways of raising money, an opponent has to file reports. You can see how their fundraising is going. With a super PAC, they can wait till the last 6 weeks of a campaign. So you're doing everything right. You're working as hard as you can. But the potential for this money to drop out of the air on you is hovering over you. So I think it does increase the sort of high agitation factor. And then just the other comment I'll make is 30 to 70% of your time fundraising means nobody can concentrate anymore. Because it's not like you fundraise in the morning and then you legislate in the afternoon. You vote, you go fundraise. You come back, you vote, you go fundraise. So you can never like get your own individual collective concentration sort of under control, let alone the concentration of the entire institution at a time when we would need all of our collective concentration to solve the kinds of policy challenges that we're facing right now. No wonder that we have this circus when it comes to making public policy in Washington, because we're all going around like this all the time. So I think it's very real, and if we don't address it, good people are going to leave or be defeated, and other good people who might want to make a career choice of getting into this will decide, you know, why would I do that to myself?
Do you think this makes attitudes more polarizing because you have so little time?
There's a lot of things that contribute to the polarization, but certainly money in politics is one, because, again, the interests put a harness on you. If your campaign is being bankrolled by a certain set of interests, they've got a harness on you, and if you venture too far into the red zone of compromise, they'll pull you back, and this can happen on both sides. Again, can be traced back to the influence of money. I mean, once you start to look for the money, you see it everywhere, and it's really debilitating for how we do our work there.
You know, this recent book by Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann about the polarization of the Congress, and they do describe it as asymmetrical, as going a lot farther on the Republican side. But they back up what John is saying, and one of their major explanatory factor is the financial system. This is interested money. This is money that isn't often going to encourage you to compromise, to be reasonable, to find solutions. Moreover, the ads that it buys are scorching ads. I mean, they're very, 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 very negative. They do anything but bring people together. You know, one very practical effect of this escalating money race and the likelihood or the possibility of some kind of super PAC coming in, you're right. You have to raise more and more and more money, anticipating the possible magnitude of this. And one very practical effect is that members aren't able to, they become much less generous in helping each other. Now, I happen to think it's a good thing when members help each other, help the team. I try to do a lot of that. When I can afford to do it, I try to help like-minded colleagues, people who I respect and want to help. And oh, that just dries up. If someone is afraid that they're going to be carpet bombed, then they're going to hold on to their money. I mean, they're going to understand that they may have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars within a few days to fight back. Let me just one about this shaming thing. I wish for the day when that kind of when the cultural environment has changed to the extent that this. I think a lot of what we're talking about could take hold if there was more of a kind of shaming aspect. But let me just read just how far we are from this. This is from this American Prospect article. This is about Sheldon Adelson. Far from ruining his misspent millions, Adelson came away convinced that he simply hadn't invested enough. Next time around, he vowed, I'll spend that much and more. Why not? His 2012 investment had amounted to the merest sliver of his total wealth. Besides, if he hadn't bought a president, he had won his bet on the next senator, the Republican Dean Heller of Nevada. The next time, who knows? In the week after the election, 3 2016 presidential wannabes, Governors Bobby Jindal, John Kasich, and Bob McConnell all made pilgrimages to Adelson's Venetia Resort Casino Hotel. Adelson's lawsuit hasn't rendered him less powerful. His willingness to spend mega millions had made him potentially the most powerful kingmaker in America. which helps explain why a few weeks after the election he could jet to Washington and score private audiences with House Speaker John Boehner and Majority Leader Eric Cantor, and on and on. It's sickening. And so I fervently wish for a movement, for an awakening of moral and political outrage at all this. And there are some things that may be achievable. There are other things that are much farther down the road. But in the post-Watergate era, we did see that kind of uprising of public opinion and reform sentiment, and I think it's long overdue. And so I'm very, very grateful that you've put this discussion on, given us a chance to get together, and we have a lot of potential in this state, I think, to bring this issue to a new level, and I very much hope we can do so.
I want to, and before you applaud too much, because this is going to be a sobering comment, I want to thank the congressman, both congressmen, and also posit one other level of the pernicious nature of money in this system, and that is who wants to be in leadership in our parties, because all of the challenges they talked about at the individual candidate level get magnified for those candidates or those elected members who decide to climb the leadership ladder, because not only do they get ready, or do we get ready for the super PAC, we also have to contribute to those identified candidates who, like John Boehner, will later go tap to vote for us in leadership positions. And that money pressure continues on the individuals as well. Some of them are self-funders who come in the system and can write the check to get votes. They're actually buying votes. Look at the influence of money in our process. They're buying votes to get into the leadership, Eric Cantor and others. And so understand that layer of influence by money dictates our policy, because obviously they get in leadership and decide what bills make it to the floor, what bills get to the committees, et cetera, et cetera. So the pressure is maybe magnified, I don't know how many times over, but know that it is there, that there's several layers of this we have to deal with, and character is not going to be enough to overcome those temptations and those pressures.
Thank you very much. I have one last quick comment. I think this discussion's been terrific. It has confirmed one of my anxieties, which is that as we beautifully illustrate the problem, heartfelt ways, there is the temptation to become soul weary, as my opening suggestion. So I just want to second what David Price said about moral outrage. We tend to think of it as something to be embarrassed by, hyper-partisanship. I think without moral outrage, our democracy would be thoroughly dead. We need to channel moral outrage in constructive political ways, and not simply railing against the entire system, but my challenge to Duke students would be your right to vote. The voting culture that has evolved over the last 8 years here, last 4 years, is under threat. The voter ID bill may make it impossible for you to vote on campus. We may not have early voting. If that creates some sense of moral outrage, then get involved, speak up, and do something about it, because that is the pressure that pushes back, that will, in effect, preserve early voting and make it harder for, in effect, a moneyed interest to do exactly as it wants. That is the only pressure point we have. It is moral outrage. It's what citizens have. So I echo, and I've heard it in inspirational ways from all four of you. Thank you so much, and let's give them a big hand of applause.